The line from the Bible we start with today is as appropriate, as powerful, and as controversial as the day Paul the Apostle wrote it. He said, "Speak up for the right living that goes along with true Christianity." And that's where we are in a study of a letter Paul the Apostle wrote to a pastor who had recently stepped into an extremely challenging place with an equally challenging bunch of Christians. What Paul wrote next would be very awkward in our culture. I'm not talking about what he wrote, but how he wrote it, at least at first. It was what we would call a very long run-on sentence. There weren't any punctuation marks in the original Bible languages, and this run-on thought covers 13 verses today. Paul ran through specific parts of life for a wide variety of Christians, men and women, young and old, servants and masters. The first quarter of it would have been like, Titus, keep talking about right living that goes along with true Christianity, telling the older men to be serious and unruffled, sensible, knowing and believing the truth, and doing everything with love and patience, and talking to the older women about being quiet and respectful in everything they do, not going around speaking evil of others, and not being heavy drinkers, but being teachers of goodness. Piece of cake, right? One of the many challenges Bible translators have always had is figuring out where a thought begins and ends, where to put a period and where to put a comma. And they also have had to figure out when a bunch of thoughts should be linked together. Titus 1 through 11 seems like a bunch of thoughts that flow from one core thought. And that brings us back to right living that goes along with true Christianity. Last week, we saw Paul point out some things connected to that for men. In what we'll look at today, Paul showed his concern for Christian women, and he began with older women. In that setting, that would have been women who were at least in their 50s. And Paul told Titus he was to talk to them about being quiet and respectful in everything they do. Many English Bibles use the word teach rather than talk to, but the word that was there was not the usual one for teach. So this would have been more like keep talking to the older women about quietness and respect. The words for quietness and respect were complex and rich. There was a sense of the kind of humble confidence we've seen several times throughout this study. Quietness was more about the heart than the mouth. Thinking of Paul's former life as a temple-based Pharisee helps bring this alive, because he would have grown up with intense awe and reverence for God. And the words Paul used in Titus were about older women making their way through their days, remembering they were living in the presence of God. So they would continue to learn to behave and live like they were remembering they were living in the presence of God. A 16th century monk wrote a little book, but a powerful one, titled The Practice of the Presence of God, and this is just a little piece from it. We ought not to be weary of doing little things for the love of God, who regards not the greatness of the work, but the love with which it is performed. I turn the cake that is frying on the pan for love of him. It is enough for me to pick up but a straw from the ground for the love of God. Now, Paul told Titus to keep talking to the older women about making their ways through their days, remembering they were living in the presence of God and behaving like it. Our awareness of God is to show through our actions and our attitude. Paul continued, keep talking to the older women about not speaking evil of others and being heavy drinkers. Now, the second one is easier to understand than the first, so we'll start with that one. This was written to and for women on the island of Crete. The Greek god of the island was, among other things, the god of wine. People believed wine was the way to connect with that god, and the island was extremely fertile, which made wine common and popular. And not only that, it would be centuries before things like Tylenol would be invented, so wine was often used to help ease some of the aches and pains of getting older. Because of the kinds of things alcohol can do, there is always danger of getting hooked, especially in a place where overconsumption of wine was not only accepted, it was actually kind of expected. And one of the words Paul used in this warning about wine meant to be held or controlled against your will. Paul's warning about wine would extend to anything we consume that takes control of us, including the amount we consume. While we know wine was a huge problem on Crete, it is not as clear what Paul was talking about when he wrote, "Keep talking to the older women about not speaking evil of others." Several Bible versions have the word gossiping or slandering. This is not for a nanosecond saying only women gossip, nor is it saying all women rip on others with their words. However, it was apparently enough of a collective problem on Crete for Paul to feel as though he had to mention it, specifically about women. The warning would have been familiar to Titus. He had been in Ephesus when Paul's letter arrived there a couple of years earlier, including this: "Don't let ugly or hateful words come from your mouth, but instead let your words become beautiful gifts that help others. Do this by speaking words of grace to help them." Titus would have carried that from Ephesus to Crete, and it still echoes today, and not just for women. And that would fit powerfully with where we are in Titus, because Paul told him, "Speak up for the right living that goes along with true Christianity," talking to older women about being teachers of goodness. And that loops back to what we saw earlier. Paul was encouraging the older women to learn and then to talk about how godliness should reach into everything we do. That sounds something like he wrote to the Christians in Rome. He said, "Here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, your ordinary life, you're sleeping, you're eating, you're going to work, and you're walking around life, and place it before God as an offering." Where we are in Titus, Paul got specific with where older women are to do that. He said, "Keep talking to younger women about loving their husbands and children, being wise and pure, taking care of their homes, being kind, and obeying their husbands, so no one will be able to criticize the teaching that God gave us." Again, and again and again and again, while there are many things to be learned from Bible verses like these, we need to be really careful to not try to force our culture and its views into them. That would be like visiting Paris and demanding an English-speaking taxi driver from the airport, and one who takes US dollars, and one who will stop at a McDonald's on the way to the hotel, and then getting angry on Sunday because they use real wine for communion. As we read the Bible, we need to understand things about the context before we can more fully know what it means for us. And we often mess things up when we try to force our context into their things. The first thing we need to cover is the word love. In the original language, it was not a verb here. The word for love here was in the form of an adjective, a descriptive word. It was like, keep talking to younger women about being husband loving and children loving. That's more like an attitude than an action. It's not as much about the emotion of love as it is about the application of love. See, it hadn't been that long since the Cretan women were exposed to God's way and God's truth. It has a lot to say about relationships and homes, so there was a lot for them to learn. And beyond that, in any culture, everyone always has something to learn. And some of the most important things we can learn come from people older than us, no matter how old we are. Now, that's not to say old people know everything about everything, nor that everything they know is right or helpful. I'm just saying, for example, there are ways to be child loving when your daughter is 4 that will need to change when she is 14, and those will have to be adjusted when she is 24. Kind of a goofy example, but if you're afraid of your daughter drowning when she's 4, she's gonna want to be able to go beyond the kiddie pool by herself at her college graduation party. When your daughter is 44, a friend whose oldest child is 5 won't have the same kind of advice as a friend whose children are all in their 50s. Another example, a personal one. Our anniversary is on Monday, and I still have a lot to learn about Beth loving. And after 29 years, I can be helped greatly by listening to godly men who have been married for 49 years. Well, back here in Titus, Paul continued with instructions for older women. He spoke about talking to the younger women about becoming more self-controlled. In other versions, sober or temperate. The word was used for drinking wine, but it was understood far beyond it. It referred to pretty much anything that might take negative control of us, from a kind of food to an amount of food to who or what we are influenced by. It has to do with being aware of what we fill our bellies with, as well as being aware of what we're filling our minds with, because what fills our minds often controls us. And as we saw last week, a key to self-control is realizing how desperately we need the Holy Spirit's help to get self-control and to hold on to it. This is something Pastor to Pastors Paul Tripp wrote to the Holy Spirit. And I want to invite you to say this next part with me. You can do it out loud, or you can just do it up in your own head. But I do encourage you to engage more than just your ears. Again, this is what Pastor to Pastor Paul Tripp wrote to the Holy Spirit. He said, "You have called me to say no, not to you, or no to others, but to myself. I must say no to selfish desires, wrong thoughts, and dangerous emotions. I must say no to the world's values, sin's temptations, and my desire to control what only God can rule. But left to myself, I have little desire or power to say no." So, this part you don't have, but I want you to listen carefully to it. Again, this is to the Holy Spirit. You can say this as much as I can. Say it to the Holy Spirit for yourself. Holy Spirit, you have given me exactly what I need. It's the only thing that will solve this kind of problem. You have given me your Spirit, so when necessary, I am able to say no. And that is the key to self-control. The next thing Paul said was that older women were to keep talking to younger women about being pure or chaste in some Bibles, although chaste does not get much use these days. A lot of teaching in fairly recent years limited that to the area of sexuality, and limited that even further as something mostly for women. The Cretan culture was a lot like ours in that it was extremely sexualized, although what made it that way was quite different. The people there believed the god who dominated Crete was Dionysus, the god of wine, as we heard earlier, and the god of fertility. That led to a twisted belief that sex with anyone was a form of worship. There were even prostitutes at their temples to help lead worship, if you understand what I'm saying. The whole matter of purity and sexuality would have been uniquely challenging because Crete was dominated by Grecian thought. Everything was about pleasure, which was all about superficial beauty, which went hand in hand with youth. So you can likely imagine how that further twisted things in their minds, how that was further twisted by their God being the god of fertility. And it all fed a lie that said women matter less when they age. Well, the gospel turned that completely upside down, repeatedly proclaiming that God says older people are uniquely valuable in his kingdom. Paul always had his eyes open for older people who knew that. And in the area of sexuality, he knew younger Christian women needed extra help and guidance, especially from older godly women. The word Paul used for chaste or pure was not limited to sexuality. Jesus' brother James expanded and illustrated its meaning when he wrote, "The wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure." And there's the word we're focusing on right now. First of all, pure and full of quiet gentleness. That sounds a lot like what we just saw. It is peace-loving and courteous. It allows discussion and is willing to yield to others. It is full of mercy and good deeds. Those are the kinds of things Paul had in mind for women where we are in Titus. And he continued with another subject that collides with things in our culture. The NIV Bible says younger women are to be busy at home. It was originally one word, what we call a compound word, combining their widely used word for home with the common word for work hard. So it would have been like hard working at home. Whatever people in other cultures may think, women there and then spent most of their time at home. But exhale, because this did not seem to say that is the way it is to be in all cultures forever. But in the context of Crete at that time, and given other things Paul has already addressed, it appears he was emphasizing the work part of it, especially because it would have been culturally acceptable to kind of let things slide at home and to focus on more sensual things and sensual pleasures. And Paul's words were countercultural in other ways. Think back on how he said older women are to remember they are living in the presence of God and behaving like it, which included working like they knew they were in the presence of God. Paul would have memorized the key writings of King Solomon, which included a command like this: whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. And most of what women on Crete had to do was at or for home. And the words Paul used for women there had a lot to do with the attitude and the heart that they showed working at and for home. There are all kinds of places where the Bible makes it clear that in a Christian marriage, the husband's role is not just about making sure his wife does all the housework. Servant leadership is as much for cleaning the bathroom as it is for a corporate boardroom. Now, the last thing Paul told the older Christian women in this portion was to be talking to younger women about submitting to their husbands. And that included helping them understand what biblical submission really is. As much as anything, submission is a spirit-fed attitude that continually learns to genuinely ask, how can I serve this person? How can I serve this person right here, right now? That kind of submission is all through the New Testament, and it is to be a mutual thing among believers. As mentioned earlier, Titus would have been in Ephesus when Paul's letter got there, and it included this line about submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Christians are never to tell others to submit. We're not to demand or to make anyone submit. To submit to someone under conditions like that would not be biblical submission. Paul mentioned it specifically to Titus for younger women and their husbands on Crete because it would have made them stand out there for good, godly reasons. See, hooking up with all kinds of people was accepted to the point of being expected, and that often had women being forced to submit to all kinds of men. Paul said Christian women were to be submitting to, serving their husbands. And there was a little word included in the original language that told them to be submitting to their own husbands as opposed to any other man. And in that culture, that would have been difficult and it would have been unpopular, especially in the area of sexuality. And it would have even impacted the way women dressed outside the home. We need to briefly, but seriously, look at a key thing in this area, especially for women and girls. This is not at all about having to submit to any male, including a husband, who is trying to physically, emotionally, or spiritually force you to do something that will hurt you physically, emotionally, or spiritually. Some of those things will be very personal, very individual, and will be different from female to female. But submitting to someone who is trying to do something that will hurt you is not the kind of submission the Bible teaches. To the contrary, it would be what Paul wrote at the end of this portion. It would be dishonoring God and what he says. And that brings us to the end of this long run-on sentence. And I don't have anything specific to tell anyone to do in physical terms out of this portion in Titus, especially because we're all at different stages in our lives and with God. So what I'm going to do is just read today's portion again. And as I do, I encourage, maybe I challenge you to be thinking about where you are in life and or with God. And as you do that, be watching for something, just maybe even just one thing that stands out to you. And this actually includes my fellow males. There are ways we can help the females in our worlds with this sort of thing, being sensitive to the kinds of things they're grappling with. And who knows, God may bring to mind something we have done that has hurt a female in one or some of these areas, and this may be about seeking forgiveness from God or from someone. Now, ladies, watch for something that stands out, something that needs work in you, something you could use help with. Ask God and keep asking God to connect you with someone who can help. Or maybe something stands out that you've learned or have been healed from. And if that's the case, spend some time thanking God for that, and then ask Him to connect you with someone you might be able to help in that area. And just so you know, next week we will take a look at godly singleness. That's not directly addressed in Titus, but it is a very important part of the conversation in our culture and in our community. So, again, this is the portion that we have been picking apart today. And wherever you are in the journey and whatever your gender, I challenge, encourage you to watch for something, just maybe one thing that stands out. Because God told Titus to be teaching the older women to live the way those who serve the Lord should. They should not go around saying bad things about others or be in the habit of drinking too much wine or other things today. They should teach what is good. By doing this, they will teach the younger women to love their husbands and their children. They will teach the younger women to be wise and pure, to take care of their homes, to be kind, and to be willing to serve their husbands. Then no one will be able to criticize the teaching God gave us. Living the way those who serve the Lord should.